join us. Welcome all speakers.
Thanks, everybody. Hi, my name is Quintin, and I'm from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I'm here today to talk to you about web-based tracking and Privacy Badger and what we're doing to stop it. Let me tell you a little bit about the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're a nonprofit that defends civil liberties in the digital world, things like freedom of speech and the right to be protected from unreasonable search and seizure, anti-censorship stuff, privacy, pro-privacy, things like that. We do this through a combination of impact litigation, which is, we try to take things to court and get them to the Supreme Court, activism of the traditional and online kind, and technology. Projects like HTTPS Everywhere, and which is a browser extension that tries to encrypt all your HTTP connections. Let's Encrypt, which is a new certificate authority that we're starting to give out free SSL certificates. Panopticlick, which tests browser fingerprinting, and Privacy Badger, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm a staff technologist at EFF, which basically means I'm a programmer and security researcher, so I can't answer any legal questions you have, because I am not a lawyer. So today we're going to talk about browser tracking. It's a bigger problem than you might think. And you might be kind of aware of it. You see ads, like if you go on Amazon and search for something, then you'll see ads for that for the rest of the day or for the rest of the month, right? But it's a bigger problem than just that. We're going to talk about why privacy matters and who is tracking us, what they're doing with it, how they're doing it, and what our plan is to stop it. So your browser is being tracked all the time. Most websites include multiple third-party trackers. And what do I mean when I say third-party trackers? A third-party tracker is a resource that's loaded from a domain other than the one you intended to connect to. So if you connect to CNN.com, for example, right, it loads resources from Google and from DoubleClick, which is an advertising company, and from Scorecard Research, which is an analytics and data mining company, and a bunch more, right? And almost every website loads these third-party resources. And many of these are designed to track you, track what you read online, track your browsing habits, track what you're interested in buying, things like that. And this is really big business. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Tracking what you read online is huge. And it lets people build up not just advertising profiles of you, but personality profiles. And what are your interests? What do you read? What do you buy? Who are you friends with? What do you do, right? So who are some of the people that are interested in tracking you? Well, there's some obvious ones. First parties like Amazon, Facebook, and Google, right? When you go to Amazon and look at products on Amazon, they're tracking what you're looking at, right? This is, Facebook is tracking what you read and who your friends are. Google is tracking what you search for when you go to Google, right? This is, and the concept of privacy is a little hard to define here, right? Whether they're non-consensually tracking you, because you've gone to this site and you're typing in search terms and you're doing this, right? And you ostensibly have an idea that they are doing this, right, on their own websites. There's also malware and spyware, right, and just sort of applications that have a good function but also maliciously track you as a side effect, right? These are things like WeatherBug, and I don't know, you probably installed Talking Tom or Bonzi Buddy if you were alive a long time ago. Things like that also tend to be spyware and trackers, right? But those may provide a useful or entertaining function. People usually install those, somewhat purposefully, or at least they were installing some other software and accidentally clicked through a screen that asked if they wanted to install this crap, right? It's a little hard to defend against these. Mainly it's about stopping malware, right? Which is about user education and, teaching people about security, teaching people what malware and spyware look like and how to not install it, right? And then there's third-party trackers, which are what are really interesting to me and what I want to talk about today. And these are specifically non-consensual, right? You're not really necessarily aware that they're there on these websites, right? Other than peripherally because you see an ad for something you were looking at. So who are some of the key players in this industry? There's companies like Google and Facebook and DoubleClick, which are advertising networks, right? Facebook is present and Google are present on almost every website, right? Either through a like button or through Google advertisements or through Google Analytics, right? There's companies like AddThis. AddThis is they provide social widgets that you can click on, right? They also do a lot of browser fingerprinting, which we can talk about later. And they're really interested in tracking. Their business model is building up profiles, tracking profiles. There's groups like Scorecard Research that do some analytics and also do data mining on what people's interests are. And then there's companies like Axicom and Spokio, which are really scary. These essentially are data brokers. And their business model is just to take all of this data and build up the total profile about you and link that with real identity information from Facebook and from Google and things like that, so that you get a complete picture of, like, I am Cooper Quintin, I live in Berkeley, and I have these interests, and I search for these things on the web, right? So that's what these guys' jobs are. Spokio sells this as a service. This is like stalking as a service, essentially. You can go to Spokio and pay them some money and put in a name, and they'll show you everything they know about that person, like where they live, what their phone number is, what their interests are, and everything else. Side note, I almost worked there before I figured out what they were, and I'm really glad. They fired me on the first day, and I'm really glad that they did. So third-party trackers, and like I said, they're non-consensual. You don't really know that they're there. Like when you go to, this is opposed to, like, as opposed to Amazon, right? When you go to Amazon, you kind of know that Amazon is probably keeping a log of all the things you search for, right? But you might not necessarily know that, DoubleClick and Facebook are keeping a log of everything you visit when there's a like button there, right? Or that Scorecard Research, which you won't even see, right, is keeping a log of everything you read. And they're ubiquitous, like I said. It's on almost every website, right? And they're hard to avoid. Most people, or many people, don't even think to install an ad blocker or tracker blocking software or anything like that, right? And unless you do, they're pretty hard to avoid. And there's a strong financial incentive for these third-party trackers, right? This is sort of become the de facto business model of the web, is selling advertisements and building up, these advertising profiles and using that to do more targeting and things like that. There's one other group that I haven't mentioned that third-party tracking is also really useful for, and that's spies. The National Security Agency is actually, in several ways, very interested and finds third-party tracking very useful. There's a few good stories about this. NSA using Google third-party cookies to determine who people are online to pinpoint targets, right? Piggybacking on other third-party trackers. And then this program by my friend Michael Lee, story about the NSA using, so cell phone applications have their own analytics, right? And the NSA was using phone analytics to as a vector to spy on smartphones and intercept communications. This is a really great article, by the way, and if you have some time later, I recommend finding that. And there's a lot of other good stuff on the intercept, too, if you're interested in the NSA and the spy world and all the Snowden information and how they're doing that sort of thing. So this is all big business. But, who cares, right? I mean, everybody says, privacy is dead anyway, right? The death of privacy. Privacy is dead. Get over it, right? And that's all well and good. So, really? Privacy is dead, huh? That's really interesting. That's a really interesting concept. What kind of people are saying privacy is dead? Oh, get over it. We don't have privacy anymore. People like this guy, Mark Zuckerberg, by the way. Might he have an interest in saying privacy is dead? Like a business interest, a several billion-dollar business interest? Maybe. He might. I think he does. Does he really think privacy is dead? Well, this is interesting. He spent $30 million buying the 4 neighboring houses next to his house for more privacy. Also, last time I checked, he hasn't published his Facebook password or his email password. So clearly, he's pretty interested in privacy for himself, but maybe not for you. So I think privacy is dead is a piece of propaganda, and I think it's bullshit. Why should you care about privacy? I think there are a lot of reasons for us to care about privacy, right? You may want to read things that are controversial or embarrassing. You may want to read things for research. You may want to read things just because you're generally interested in them. And this doesn't necessarily say anything bad about you, right? As a free society, we should be able to research controversial and even illegal topics, as long as we're not, breaking these laws, right? And or if you're in George Lennon's class, you might want to research malware and viruses, right? That shouldn't necessarily paint you as a malware author, right? That shouldn't paint you as a black hat credit card stealing hacker just because you want to research malware. So I think there are a lot of reasons for privacy, right? There's also data about what you're reading may be fine on its own, right? And you may not be embarrassed about it on its own, but it might be more embarrassing when you put it together. For example, if you were searching for health insurance quotes, and then you were looking up information about an embarrassing disease on WebMD, I might be able to conclude with a pretty high probability that you have that disease or that you think you have that disease. And if I know that you have a disease that you're trying to keep secret, that's a pretty embarrassing and pretty important piece of information about you, right? I might decide not to give you a loan because you're going to die in a year and not pay it back. There are a lot of things I could do with that. And there's this chilling effect, right? Which means that when you're thinking that everything you do is being watched, right, you're less willing to sort of go out on a limb and explore things that are outside of maybe the bounds of polite society, right? And this really has a chilling effect on creativity, right? It stifles our willingness to, think creatively and think about things that might not be okay in the bounds of society. Right? Privacy lets us make mistakes and play with ideas. Right? When we're children, we need privacy so we can grow as individuals, right? And do embarrassing things and not have to be afraid of that. It gives us the space to discover who we are. And I think that's really important. So yeah, privacy is dead. That's propaganda. And I disagree with it. Now to get in a little bit the technical side of things, how online tracking works. So, and specifically web-based tracking is what I'm going to talk about today. So there are a few different methods, and please excuse this extremely cheesy clip art that I found. IP address is the first and most obvious method, right? Every computer has an IP address. Interestingly, IP address tracking has gotten... the problem with IP address tracking, right, is that everybody behind a router will share the same external IP address, right? And we would all have a different internal IP address behind the router, right? With a new technology called WebRTC that's part of the HTML5 standard, you can actually get the internal IP address as well using something called NAT traversal and stun. And you can get the internal IP address as well as the external IP address, pretty positively identifying that specific computer, even when it's behind a router, sharing with other computers. So IP address, that's the most well-known and oldest way. Cookies are also pretty well-known, right? A cookie is a piece of text on your browser that may contain a short piece of text, but it can contain some information, either maybe about your preferences, or it can contain a unique ID. It can contain a lot of different things, right? And cookies are definitely the widest used method of tracking, right? They're the main method that we see all the time. And they're pretty well known. You can clear cookies in your browser. Everybody kind of knows how to do that, and vaguely at least knows that cookies could be used to track, or that cookies could be bad, even if they're not really sure why. And then there's something called super cookies. And so super cookies are very similar to cookies. They use different HTML5 technologies like local storage and the database API and things like that, and cache tags. And these are they act the same as cookies. They store a little unique ID for you, but they're much harder to get rid of in your browser. Browser manufacturers, for the most part, haven't implemented any ways, or implemented very few or very obtuse ways to clear these data stores, clearing HTML5 local storage. How many of you know off the top of your head how to clear HTML5 local storage? Yeah, okay. How about Flash local storage objects? So these are all forms of super cookies, and there's no ways in the browser, no good ways in the browser to clear these super cookies. So these are a technique that's being used more and more. by trackers as people become, as people become more aware of cookies, and the EU has privacy laws about setting cookies, right? Super cookies become more prevalent. Also, browser fingerprinting. And so this is where your browser, as you're browsing, actually has a set of properties that tend to make it pretty unique amongst all other browsers in the world. Things like the number of fonts you have installed, what order they're presented in, what fonts you have installed, your screen size, the way that your browser renders like images when it's given canvas data, right, using HTML5 APIs, your clock skew, the what plugins you have installed, right, what extensions you have installed. There are many ways to fingerprint a browser, and you can get a really unique signature for the browser based on all of these properties, right? Your user agent. So EFF actually has a really cool project called Panopticlick, and this is a thing that will test how it does some fingerprinting and tests actually how unique your browser is. And I encourage you to take a look at that. It's pretty neat. And you can see how unique your browser is, and it'll probably be completely unique. So this is a pretty big problem. There's a lot of methods of tracking here, right? So what can we do to stop this? Well, there are a few different things that have historically been tried, right? One of them is ad blockers, right? Ad blockers are they've been around for a while, right? The problem with ad blockers is that they usually only block ads, right? And they're not necessarily blocking trackers by default. With AdBlock Plus, you have to enable an extra list to block trackers, right? There are a few other, Ghostery doesn't block anything by default. It just shows you what's tracking you, helpfully. And there's also a bit of an arms race problem with ad blockers, because most ad blockers work off of a blacklist of known advertising URLs or known advertising URL snippets paths, like subpaths, right? And the problem is that, okay, so I've started coopersadservice.com, right? And I get that on a blacklist. Well, I can just register coopersadservice2 through 1million.com and just give each user a random URL, right? A random domain name with which to track them, and then correlate all that data later on the back end, right? So it's actually, there's an arms race problem where you have to be putting things on your blacklist faster than advertisers are registering new domains. And registering domains is really cheap. In fact, it might cost more to get somebody to verify this is actually a tracker and put it on the list than it does to register a new domain name with a bot you've created. There's incognito browsing, and this actually conflates a couple of things that I want to separate out. There's incognito mode in your browser, right? This is not really going to protect your privacy all that much because it's still vulnerable to fingerprinting, right? And it's even still vulnerable to some forms of super cookies, such as ISP cache layers. Will often can cache a unique image for you, and that could serve as a super cookie, right? So incognito browsing doesn't really do much except keep things out of your history. And if your threat model is somebody else that's sharing your computer, then that's great. But if your threat model is third-party tracking, then incognito browsing isn't actually going to do much against that. And then there's Tor browser, which is completely different from incognito browsing, which is why I don't want to conflate these two. Tor browser. How many of you do not know what Tor is? Okay, there's a couple. So Tor is an anonymity network that lets you browse the internet while hiding your IP address, right? And Tor browser is the browser that you should use while you're using Tor, because Tor browser has some really strong defenses against super cookies and fingerprinting and other methods of tracking, right? To help keep you anonymous, since that's the goal if you're using Tor. And Tor browser is great. It's really the best, some of the best anonymity technology we have, and I do highly recommend it. Unfortunately, for most people, Tor is not usable, and Tor browser is not usable 24/7 for them, right? It can be a little slow, right? You have to think differently about your privacy, right? It might be a little silly to log into Facebook over Tor, for example, right? And so, unless you're in a country where that is censored, right? And you're trying to not even let your country know that you're connecting to Facebook, in which case it's quite useful. Not really the case here as much, though. So Tor browser, well, great, isn't really usable 24/7, right? And then there was some policy work, right? There was the do not track standard. And this was a standard in the W3C, the World Wide Web Coalition. This is the standards body that comes up with all of our regulations for the World Wide Web. Do not track was a header that would be passed along with every request you made on the web. And it was an opt-in, so you had to specifically, the standard was said that you had to specifically, check a setting in your browser that would then send this header, right? And the idea was that if you set this header, advertisers would agree not to track you, right? Unfortunately, this is a really good example of design by committee and how it can go wrong, especially when the adversary, in this case, advertisers and trackers, is on the committee designing the standard, right? So there was no enforcement provision in DNT, and there wasn't even really a promise, right? It was, if you send DNT, we'll do something, maybe. If we respect DNT, maybe we'll do something, right? And often that something turned out to be, well, we won't show you targeted advertisements. We're still going to track you. You're just not going to get any of the ostensible benefits of that. Because, hey, I guess you don't want to see targeted advertisements. You just prefer to see random ones. But no, we're going to track you. So unfortunately, Do Not Track was kind of a failure. It had a really low level of adoption, right? Yahoo was one of the few big adopters, and Twitter were some of the few big adopters, and Yahoo doesn't even support it anymore. So DNT is kind of considered a failure. And there are some similar programs that were created entirely by the by the advertising industry. Things like ad choices. You might see like a little blue triangle at the top of ads now, and it says like ad choices or something. And if you click that, there's a thing where you can opt out from seeing targeted ads. But again, it's an opt out from seeing targeted ads, not an opt out from being tracked, right? So DNT was a bit of a failure, unfortunately, right? So what do we do next? So the next tactic from EFF was a combination of tech and policy. And this is where Privacy Badger comes in. I'm finally going to get to the thing that was the title of this talk. So what is Privacy Badger? Privacy Badger is a browser add-on, not a plugin. I wrote this last night. Sorry, guys. Browser add-on that blocks third-party trackers. It's open source. It's EFF are the maintainers of it. And it focuses on completely blocking trackers, right? Our aim is not to block advertisements necessarily, unless they're tracking advertisements, right? And it sort of tries to solve this arms race problem that I mentioned before about ad blockers, right? Instead of having a blacklist, we use an algorithm for each person to try to determine what's a tracker and block that immediately. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that algorithm looks like in a second here. The thing about you, okay. So how does that algorithm work? I said in a second. So what it does is first it sends a DNT equals 1 header. This is the do not track header. That was sort of the failed standard, right? But this is our, if somebody really does respect this, right, we would like to, express that preference, right? And then we watch for requests to third-party domains. If a third-party domain behaves in a way that a tracker might behave, say like setting a high entropy cookie, and I'll explain what that is in a second, but it basically means a cookie that could be used to uniquely identify you, right? Or does other trackery things like, in the future, if it tries to set super cookies or if it tries fingerprinting techniques, then we add it to a list of potential trackers, right? If that potential tracker is seen on multiple first-party sites, then we block it, because we can assume that if a thing is acting in a trackerish way and you're seeing it in multiple places as you browse the web, it's probably a tracker. And the reason for multiple places is because there may be things that act in trackerish ways, like a content delivery network, for example, right? That's serving up static content like images and scripts for a website. But that content delivery network is only actually used for that one website, right? And so therefore it's not a tracker, even though it may be setting cookies and doing caching and behaving in trackerish ways. So on a high entropy cookie, in information theory, when we talk about entropy, what that means is the amount of information that could be contained in a message, right? Usually in units such as bits. So a 2-bit message, right, would have about 2 bits of entropy. And there would be, if I gave you all a 2-bit message, there would be a 1 in 4 chance that if I picked one of you at random, you would have a specific message that I had picked, right? A low entropy cookie is something like, a low entropy cookie is something like lang equals ES, right? This is a preference. This is setting your language to Spanish, right? If we figure that there are about 255 language codes that we could use, this provides about 8 bits of entropy, right? Meaning 1 in 255. That may sound like a lot, but it's actually nothing when you consider that humanity, or the population of the internet, is about 4 billion people, give or take, right? A high entropy cookie is something like this. This is sort of an example of what like a Google tracking cookie might look like, right? This gives you about 48 bits of entropy, or approximately 1 in 281.5 trillion chance of uniquely, or not chance, 281.5 trillion chance of colliding with another person's unique cookie, right? So this pretty uniquely identifies you. And that's what I'm talking about when I say these are the sort of cookies that we're looking for that give us a pretty strong indicator that they're being used for tracking. So occasionally a tracker can be blocked without creating significant problems for the user. Things like YouTube, Google Maps, things like that. And for those, instead, we block cookies. And in the future, we'll try to block super cookies and fingerprinting, although that's not there right now. This is work still to be done. And so that's sort of the compromise, right? Because with this algorithm, right, with the algorithmic approach, there are some false positives, right? Things that aren't actually trackers get categorized as trackers, right? Or, well, that could be used as trackers, but that's not their intent, right? And things that are not and things that are trackers, but are only tracking, via really devious super cookies, right, are not being captured right now because we still have to write more code to detect super cookies. But that is future work that we plan on doing. Fortunately, most of them also fall back on cookies and use super cookies just to respawn cookies. So we catch most of them anyway. Users can see and adjust what's blocked and graylisted and cookie blocked and allowed. And they can disable Privacy Badger entirely for certain sites if they wish, if it's breaking things. And they can opt back into certain third parties for certain uses, right? Like if you want to enable Discus, right, which is like a commenting forum that gets used on a lot of websites, right? You can do that on a specific website. Like, I don't want Discus to be able to track me, but I do want to be able to comment on this Gawker blog, right? You can enable Discus for that. And so what about third-party sites that legitimately don't want to track their users, right? Third-party embeds, like if I have an OpenStreetMaps embed, right? And OpenStreetMaps has no interest in tracking users, right? This is where the policy side comes in. So EFF is working on a new do not track policy. And this is one that will be almost contractual, right? We have a document that you will put on your site, right? And we think that if you violate what's said in that document, that would be a violation of Federal Trade Commission rules, and we could sue you for misleading business practices, right? The document states that users sending DNT will not be tracked, and it states that in a few specific technical ways, right? And the idea is that Privacy Badger will not block a site that does agree to do not track, right? That does agree to this very specific standard. And we think that blocking sites that don't respect DNT and allowing allowing advertising that does respect do not track creates a monetary incentive for people to respect do not track, right? So that's the idea here. And the document contains things like discarding user identifiers, not keeping logs longer than necessary, except for debugging or security purposes, and then throwing them away afterwards, right? And things like that. So we have a discussion draft and a preliminary policy up right now at EFF.org/DNT policy. And we're in talks with some major companies to try to adopt it. And we think this will be a good thing. Also, some other tracker blocking companies are talking about adopting it as well. So we might actually be able to make this a real do not track standard that actually has teeth and is actually enforceable and actually means do not track, not just do not show me that you're tracking me. So there's still some work that needs to happen on Privacy Badger, like I said, and we need to improve the algorithms that track or that detect trackers, right? We need to improve stuff around super cookies and fingerprinting. Right now it's only in English, right? So we need translations, and we need more people to adopt our DNT policy, right? So how can you help? You can use Privacy Badger, and that's great. You can get it from EFF.org/PrivacyBadger. You can submit bug reports and pull requests. It's all open source. It's written in JavaScript. It's a browser extension. So if you're looking for an open source project to get some, contributions on to beef up your resume, or if you just like writing JavaScript, check it out. It's on GitHub at github.com/EFF.org. If you're running third parties, you can, take a look at our DNT policy and work with us on that. And of course, you can become a EFF member, sign up for our mailing list, and donate. I have some stickers here and stuff for people that have good questions, or I'll probably just leave them on the table, honestly. But you should ask good questions anyway, and I'll give you extra stickers. We still need better tools, though, right? Privacy Badger is great, but it's still kind of a stopgap, right? We need actual browser improvements, right? Things like double-keyed cookies, where a cookie is keyed to, and super cookies, where a cookie or a super cookie is keyed to the first party and the third party, right? So that this cookie is only shown actually, like when I visit CNN and it loads scorecard, right? That cookie can only be viewed by scorecard on CNN, right? And this sort of stops the correlation of multiple first parties, right? We need to harden browsers against fingerprinting. Tor browser has done a lot of great work on this, but unfortunately, none of that work has been brought back upstream into Firefox, and none of that work has really been done in other browsers. And we need better controls for blocking and clearing super cookies, right? Now, it's pretty easy to clear a cookie, but like I said, none of us actually have a clue about how to go clear some of these super cookies, right? And we also need new business models for the web, right? Like I said, tracking is sort of the main business model of the web right now. And I really think that this needs to change, right? And there are some interesting ideas, right? Memberships, membership-based sites, right? Or perks if you become a member, right? Like Reddit Gold is a pretty interesting idea, right? Donation-based sites, right? Like, hey, if you like our thing, give us some money, right? Crowdfunding, right? Things like Kickstarter. Come on, you can get a potato salad funded for like $12,000 or something. You can, if you have a decent idea for a website, you can probably get it funded, right? Things like micropayments, right? Google has this pretty interesting idea. I can't remember what it's called, but basically you would pledge, $3 a month toward paying websites that you visit, right? And anytime you visit a website participating in this program, it just automatically transfers a little chunk of your money to them, right? So that like you're just sort of donating $3 a month across the board to sites that you visit, right? And each of them gets a little chunk of that, depending how often you visit. And that turns out actually to potentially be more money than they would make through advertising, right? And then you don't get tracked. Or even just things like non-intrusive advertising, right? Maybe we do have to have advertising to fund the web, right? Because maybe people just really don't want to pay for stuff. I mean, obviously people don't want to pay for stuff, but maybe the incentive to not pay for things is more than the incentive not to be tracked, right? So it's hard to say whether or not advertising is really the best way to fund the web. But if we are going to live with advertising on the web, it must stop violating people's privacy without their consent. So that's it. Thank you very much. And it looks like we have about 5 minutes for questions. So, anybody? Yeah.
So if I run Ghostery on my browser now, will Privacy Badger interfere with those stuffs?
No. So Privacy Badger shouldn't interfere with Ghostery. They may. So one may block things before the other one gets a chance to. So you may see both of them looking like they're blocking, or one or the other looking like they're blocking less things than they should. If you have Ghostery set to block things, the default settings for Ghostery don't block anything.
Yeah, that's new. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that little purple box that shows up that shows you all the trackers, that's just showing you the trackers. That's not actually blocking any of them. You have to go drill down into the settings to actually block any of them. And I think the reason for this is that Ghostery's business model is actually to sell advertising companies data about how effective their ads are, and to sell sites data about what third parties they have on their site. Because often sites don't even know what third parties are entirely on their site, right? So this is sort of Ghostery's business model. It's a little sketchy, I think. So, yeah.
Is anybody at EFF looking at so-called business models to support the web in other countries and comparing them with our business model?
So the question was, is anybody at EFF looking at business models to support the web in other countries? And
Yeah, well, I mean, some countries, obviously, I don't think we want to adopt China's business model. But I'm just, sometimes I think we in the United States become very chauvinistic and narrow. We only look at the way we do it.
Sure.
Education is a good example.
Yeah, oh yeah,
And
definitely.
how do other countries do it? How does it work there? Healthcare is another big one.
Yeah, I mean, we have an international team that works, all over the world in web policy stuff, right? I'm not really sure. I mean, the thing about the internet is that the business models actually do seem pretty ubiquitous, right? As far as being advertising based, right? And there are some membership sites, but I think it's much less geographically local, just because of the way the internet is, right? So, I guess the answer to your question is that it's kind of vague. Oh, actually, sorry, back there. I think he had his hand up first.
Yeah, so my question is about, you were talking mostly about desktop browsing. What about mobile development for blocking trackers?
Yeah, great question. So mobile has all the same problems, right? There's all sorts of advertisements and analytics, right? The story that I mentioned, I'll never find it again. The story that I mentioned about the NSA using mobile, screw it. I don't even know where it went. Oh, there we go. The story that I mentioned about the NSA using mobile analytics, right, to help track people and identify cell phones, right? So it's obviously a big problem. The technology there is still new. Like, we don't even have so Firefox Mobile can run plugins, or can run extensions, and we don't even have a privacy badger for Firefox Mobile yet, right? So having something like that would be great. There's a couple of mobile programs, like AdBlock, I think, has a mobile app, and Disconnect, which is another one. They have a mobile app that actually just got removed from the Google Store because they said it was violating their policy of not interfering with other applications. Even though there are actually several ad blockers in the Google Store, the thing is that none of them work. And so maybe the fact that Disconnect worked was why they took it out of the Google Store. Not really clear there. Also, I mean, yeah, there was a whole host of problems with that. So yeah, there's a couple of things like that. It's still a fairly new space, right? And there's not much, unfortunately.
So does privacy sites like Anonymizer, a pay site, does that actually protect you from any of this?
I'm not familiar with Anonymizer.
Okay. It's supposed to be like an IP, you pay so much per month and you go through their servers.
Oh, is it like a virtual private network?
Kind of, I suppose, yeah.
Okay. So I mean, if it is a VPN, right? Or even if is it browser based, or is it you download some piece of software and it's browser based? I mean, the thing is, so it's sort of like a shitty VPN then. The thing with VPNs is that you're just sort of shifting your trust from your ISP to your virtual private network, right? And you might not trust your ISP because they might be AT&T, and there's a lot of really good reasons not to trust AT&T, right? But the virtual private network, you might not even know who's running that and what their policies are, right? The other thing about virtual private networks is that they're pretty bad from a technological standpoint as well, right? Things like super cookies, browser fingerprinting, shit like that. A VPN isn't going to stop any of those, right? So as far as third-party tracking and advertising goes, I don't think that VPNs are really that useful. They're only really useful in sort of hiding your IP address, but then only if the person trying to find your IP address never doesn't have the power to go ask the VPN what this person's real IP address was, right? And if they're like a nation state or somebody like that, they can certainly do that. Or if the VPN is a malicious actor, they can certainly do that, right? If you're trying to hide your IP address, a much better idea is to use Tor than a VPN.
So you're saying super cookies are like fairly recent or new? Like how prevalent are they, would you say?
Pretty prevalent. I mean, they're recent in the span of my lifetime, but like in the span of the way things move on the internet, they're ancient, right? So they're pretty prevalent. And certainly as various HTML5 technologies pick up and get adopted more, they will only become more prevalent. Most of them are based on various HTML5 things like local storage and things like that. So they really started picking up as HTML5 started picking up. But they're only going to become more and more prevalent, especially since people are, thinking about cookies, right, and thinking about these sorts of things. So, yeah, I think they're definitely a problem. I maybe have time for one more question.